In this explainer, we're going to audit the very architecture of your perception. We're diving deep into a really provocative idea that the reality you experience isn't what's actually out there, but is instead a sophisticated simulation, a story your brain is telling itself. Okay, let's just jump right in with a statement that challenges our most basic belief. You and I, we go through our day assuming our senses are a clear, honest window to the world. But the source material for this explainer says, nope, that assumption is the foundational error we all make. You know, we love to think of our senses as these crystal clear windows, just letting the outside world flood in. But the clinical reality is they're more like filters. They aren't just passively receiving information. They're actively selecting, prioritizing, and even throwing data out before it ever reaches your conscious mind. And this leads to a pretty startling conclusion. Your brain isn't experiencing the world directly at all. What it's actually doing is building a predictive simulation based on the little bits of filtered data it gets. So, in essence, you are living inside a controlled hallucination, a universe built for your survival, not necessarily for objective truth. So, if we're all living in a simulation that's based on filtered data, what does that actually mean for us? Well, this brings us to our first core concept, which is a really powerful metaphor for our condition, the sensory cage. What is this cage? Well, it's the state of being trapped by the very biological machinery that allows us to perceive in the first place. We are constantly reacting to a world that was constructed inside our own heads just moments ago, all based on those filters and predictions. We're always, literally, living slightly in the past. And here's the crucial point. If you don't understand the rules of this internal system, the architecture of your own perception, you just become a passive variable inside of it. You're basically a character in a simulation you didn't even know you were running, let alone designing. So how does this engine of reality actually work? I mean, how does the brain build its simulation? The answer lies in a really powerful concept from neuroscience, the Bayesian brain. See, your brain is not a passive receiver just sitting around waiting for data to arrive. No way. It's a full-on prediction machine. It acts as a Bayesian Inference Engine, which means it's constantly generating guesses about the world and what's going to happen next, all based on its own internal model, its memories, and past experiences. And this all happens in a constant three-step loop that runs 24/7. First, your brain predicts what it thinks it's about to see, hear, or feel. Second, a part of your brain called the thalamus, you can think of it as a sensory gatekeeper, filters the incoming data. It basically suppresses anything that already matches the prediction. Finally, only the surprises, the prediction errors, actually get through, forcing your prefrontal cortex, the brain's CEO, to update its model of the world. The goal of this entire process? To minimize surprise. Now, we can think about the accuracy of this internal simulation with a metric the source calls the Reality Distortion Coefficient, or omega. And hey, don't worry about the math here. It's more of a conceptual tool to measure how closely your internal map matches the external territory. And as you can see, the name of the game is to lower your omega. When your omega is high, you're disconnected from reality. You're just living in a world that reinforces your existing beliefs and fears. But when you lower your omega, you become way more sensitive to those crucial prediction errors, forcing your brain to build a more precise, more accurate simulation. The challenge, though, is that this internal system, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. It can be deliberately influenced, even hijacked, by forces outside of you. And this brings us to a darker concept the source calls systemic domestication. External systems, everything from media to marketing, they understand this predictive process. They know that if they can control the inputs to your brain's filtering system, they can pretty much dictate the reality you construct. So how is this done? Well, by flooding our sensory environment with high-stress, low-signal noise. Think about it. Constant breaking news alerts, the infinite social media feeds, the outrage of the day. By manipulating this sensory stream, they can force our brains to build a simulation based not on curiosity and growth, but on fear and scarcity. The source makes a really stark claim here. It suggests that by the time you're 45, if you haven't consciously audited and taken control of this perceptual process, you're no longer truly sovereign. You've effectively become a host for a hijacked simulation, just reacting to a reality designed by others. Okay, so how do we fight back? How do we reclaim control and become the sovereign architect of our own simulation? The source actually proposes a systematic approach, the Reality Protocol. This protocol is described as the art of subjective engineering, and it breaks down into 3 key steps: sensory deprivation, prediction error cultivation, and objective representation. Let's break this down because it's pretty brilliant. First, sensory deprivation. You have to systematically reduce the external noise. In that quiet, your brain's own default predictions and biases start to become visible. Second, prediction error cultivation. Instead of avoiding things that challenge you, you actively seek them out. Go read the book you disagree with. Talk to the person with a different perspective. Force your brain to update its model. And third, objective representation. This is a classic Stoic practice of seeing events for what they are, stripped of all the emotional story you've layered on top. Ultimately, the goal of this whole audit is to make a fundamental shift. It's about moving from being a passive inhabitant of a pre-rendered reality to becoming the one who actively presides over its creation. The universe isn't some movie you're just watching. It's a blank canvas. And that really leaves us with a final, provocative thought. Within the simulation of your own mind, you have a choice. Will you remain a prisoner, trapped by biological defaults and all that external noise? Or will you pick up the tools and become the architect?
Welcome. So in this explainer, we're not just going to observe reality, we're going to audit it. We're going to take a hard look at the very architecture of the world you experience, with the goal of actually engineering it. Let's get started.
Just let that sink in for a second. This isn't just some abstract philosophy, you know? It's a statement about our clinical, day-to-day reality. We all trust our senses, right? We assume they're these clean windows to the world, but they're not. They are incredibly powerful, biased filters. And this is the core idea we're digging into today. Your brain has never, ever directly experienced reality. What it does is construct a subjective universe, a simulation that's built for one main reason: survival. Not for seeing some kind of absolute truth. The world you're reacting to at this very moment, yeah, that was rendered inside your skull just milliseconds ago. Okay, so let's dive into our first section, the sensory cage. This is where we're going to define the fundamental problem. If our experience really is a simulation, then what are the walls of that simulation even made of? This brings us to this idea of a predictive simulation. Your brain isn't a passive camera just hit and record on the world. No way. Think of it more like an active, incredibly fast artist. It's taking in all this sparse, chaotic data from your senses and then rendering a stable, coherent model of what it predicts is out there. You are not seeing the territory, you're living on a map that it just drew for you. So this simulation, this internal map, that is what we're calling the sensory cage. And its bars, they're forged from your own biological biases. And if you're not aware of this cage, if you can't see the bars, then you're basically just a programmable variable in a simulation you didn't even consciously design.
So if we're living inside a simulation, what's its operating system? What's the code? Well, that brings us to our second section, the Bayesian Brain. Here, we're going to look at the biological logic that's running the whole show. This slide really breaks down the core process. Your brain is essentially what's called a Bayesian Inference Engine. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying it runs on probabilities and past experiences to constantly predict what's going to happen next. Then you've got your thalamus. It acts like a gatekeeper, like a bouncer at a really exclusive club, and it actively suppresses sensory information that doesn't fit with what your brain already predicted. It literally filters out the unexpected.
But why? Why does it do this? Well, it all comes down to something called the free energy principle. You see, the brain's core drive isn't to find objective truth, it's to minimize surprise. It's an organ that is hardwired for survival. And a lot of the time, survival just means sticking to what's familiar, what's predictable, and confirming what it already thinks it knows. So this gap between your internal model and the truth of what's out there, we can give it a name. Let's call it the Reality Distortion Coefficient. Just think of it as a way to measure how much your personal simulation is drifting away from objective reality. And here's where it gets really dangerous. When that coefficient gets too high, you're not navigating the world with a helpful map anymore. You are trapped in a feedback loop. You start to experience a reality that's built mainly to confirm your own fears and biases, not one that serves your personal freedom and sovereignty. Which, of course, brings us to the most critical question in this entire explainer. If our brains are just these filtering machines running a simulation, then who or what has an interest in messing with the settings on that filter?
This is where we step into the shadow of unrefined perception.
This is the cognitive panopticon. In this section, we're going to explore how the brain's natural filtering process can be exploited, leading to what the source material calls the systemic domestication of the mind.
The source material actually gives this external system a name, the Leviathan. And its strategy is simple, but it's incredibly profound. The Leviathan gets it. It understands that if it can control the sensory inputs feeding your brain's gatekeeper, the thalamus, it can pretty much dictate the reality that your brain simulates.
And here's how it does it. These are its primary tactics. First, you've got sensory flooding. By just overwhelming you with high-stress, low-signal noise. Think about the endless streams of chaotic news and social media. It forces your brain to default to a simulation based on fear and scarcity. And then there's confusion. The architects of this system, they profit from uncertainty. Because when you're confused, your so-called opinions become little more than pre-rendered responses to a totally manipulated stream of information.
This is a stark warning about the cost of just doing nothing. Without deliberately auditing your own perception, your mind seriously risks becoming a host for a hijacked simulation. You might think you're seeing the sun, but what you're really seeing is just the system's version of light.
Okay, so how do we fight back? This brings us to our final section, and we're shifting from the threat to the solution. It's time for the Reality Protocol. This is the art of subjective engineering. This is the manual for taking back control of your own perception.
So let's walk through this protocol. Step 1 is sensory deprivation. You have to systematically silence the noise. By cutting down on the external input, meditation, or even just spending time in total silence, you force your brain to reveal its own internal biases. In that silence, the simulation itself starts to become visible. Step 2 is prediction error cultivation. This means you have to intentionally, actively look for information that contradicts your current model of the world. The goal isn't to defend your reality, it's to destroy it and upgrade it. And finally, step 3 is objective representation, which is an idea that comes from Stoic practice.
And this slide illustrates that last step perfectly. It's all about moving from the emotional story to the objective blueprint. So instead of the narrative, "I failed," you see the blueprint, a specific sequence of events occurred. You're stripping away that emotional layer to see the raw data of what actually happened.
We're back to this number 45, and it's a powerful call to action. But why? Well, because the passive accumulation of unexamined beliefs, it compounds over time, like bad debt. The work of becoming the conscious architect of your own simulation isn't just important, it is urgent.
The key takeaway is this: you don't just inhabit reality, you preside over its rendering. This final metaphor totally reframes your role. You go from being a passive observer to an active creator. The power to define your experience is and always has been your own.
And that concludes our perception audit. Remember the protocol. Audit your inputs. Destroy and rebuild your models. Reclaim your sovereignty. Stay silent, stay wise.